Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to focus in on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and things that you can believe in at every stage of your life. And we're doing this for helping you with your paradigm shifting and your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview. And because as we see it, we're on the eve of the collapse of Western religious values, as we are beginning to recognize that our Bible, both the New Testament and Old Testament, are discredited. And we've been looking at many different theories of that, but primarily that it was written by the Romans in the first century, late first century, the Flavian emperors from 69 to 96 AD, and their instrument by the name of Josephus, who was allegedly a Jew who was one of the generals in the Jewish war against the Romans from 66 to 73 AD, and then he surrendered to the Roman general Vespasian, and at a certain point defected, and saying that he believed that God was now favoring the Romans and not the Jews. And he gave Vespasian the star prophecy telling him that he someday is going to become emperor. When he did become emperor in 69 AD, Vespasian remembered what Josephus said to him and adopted him as a son, and moved him to the royal court at Rome, where he became a court historian and wrote The War of the Jews and also Jewish Antiquities over a 25-year period. And if you read War of the Jews, especially in conjunction with reading the Gospels, you'll be able to tell that there are thousands of parallels, and that whoever wrote one wrote the other, and that there is a huge level of mockery and derision involved. This was a mean-spirited attempt to humiliate anybody who believes this, and it was also an attempt to pacify the Jews, who were a big pain in the side of the Romans. Their colonizers, starting from 63 BC or so, and by this time, in the late first century, they were pretty much fed up with putting down insurrections and revolts and so on from these crazy zealous Jews. And so they wanted to present us with a Prince of Peace who believed in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and many other forms of pro-Romanism. The Gospels were mysteriously published in Greek, even though Jesus was said to have spoken in Aramaic. And the mere fact that it is written in Greek shows that it was written by someone who was Hellenized, and under the influence of Western values as opposed to Jewish. And that was very common among Jews at that time. Whoever wrote it, the Gospels obviously knew a great deal about Old Testament prophecy and history. But the mockery, a lot of the mockery comes in where Jesus says something metaphorically, predicting into the future. And then one of the Roman generals, either Vespasian or Titus, fulfills the prophecy literally. So that's kind of one of the great patterns. And we're going to look at a lot of that work coming up here next week. Before that, we're going to get into a little bit of study of not only Dead Sea Scrolls, but many of the other apocryphal works in the work of Robert Eisenman and his book called The New Testament Code. We're trying to kind of avail ourselves of as many different codes to attack this New Testament and decode it as possible. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are very fertile for using the same type of language that is used in the Gospels. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, so-called, in the mid-20th century after having been buried in a cave, in a bunch of caves near Jericho, about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and about 1900 years before that. And they tell a story that is very similar to some of the stories in the Gospels, using the same type of jargon. There's all kinds of stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls, though. It's kind of daunting, overwhelming, and that's why Eisenman is a great resource here, because he's looked at all of it. He was probably the main person who is responsible for us knowing what we do know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the international team of scholars who was responsible for translating it and organizing it and putting it out there to the public shirked on their duties when they realized that the Dead Sea Scrolls said a whole lot of things that went against their Catholic faith. And Eisenman put their feet to the fire about 30 years later, and by the early 90s, these were in circulation. Now, we're in the preliminaries of this book. We're just going to go through this chapter, and we'll see where we go from there. But the preliminaries, and he's talking about how he goes over many of the different texts, especially the Clementines, Pseudo-Clementines, and also the Damascus document, some of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Acts, and some of the stuff from church fathers and stuff, and makes many comparisons. He calls it a shell game. How different versions refer to different people with different terms. But he basically concludes that there's a character in the Book of Acts called the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. And the Herods were the puppet princes and kings of Palestine, hired by the Romans to look after the Jews, and they were hated mostly. But he concludes that Paul is one of the Herods. And we went through that yesterday. He goes through the texts in detail. And so we're going to wrap up that section, and then we're going to get to the next section, which is called the Anti-Semitic Peter, which is also eye-opening. Okay, we'll start right here. Therefore, we have alluded to him as the Herodian Paul. And therefore, too, it is possible to assert that Paul, not Manaen, whoever he may have been, would have more likely been the one brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. A fact, Acts, Lucan, or Luke, artificer, would have been at pains to obscure. with only a slight lateral displacement, just as with James, his brother, meaning James, the brother of John, not James, the brother of Jesus, above. This is exactly what one ends up with, and this embarrassing fact is easily overwritten and erased. These things, as they may be, these are the kinds of analyses and insights one is able to achieve and will achieve further below if one pursues this kind of information without preconceptions or prior commitment, and with a modicum of common sense and intelligence. And this is really, he's referring to the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the other Apocrypha, and being able to compare the different texts and to kind of figure out the shell game. But the real existence of the shell game, I think, is very good evidence for the fact that the Romans had a big hand in this. And as we start this section, the anti-Semitic Peter, we can definitely see the Roman fingerprints all over the Gospels. Okay, so this section is called the anti-Semitic Peter. Another rewarding avenue of analysis are the speeches attributed to Peter in Acts, and the contrast of these with the portrait of Peter in the Pseudo-Clementines. In Acts, Peter is presented as a mouthpiece for anti-Semitic invective, but this kind of Peter is hardly, if ever, in evidence in the Pseudo-Clementines, whichever version one consults, the homilies or the recognitions. In our view, the Pseudo-Clementines, now I'm not exactly sure what the date of approximate date of those are, but they're kind of like romantic stories. They don't claim to be history, but they're every bit as much history as Acts and the Gospel. So in our view, the Pseudo-Clementines do not simply parallel Acts. Rather, they are based on the same source as Acts, to which they are the more faithful. This is certainly the case with the Recognitions, the first book of which links up with Acts in an almost point-for-point manner, albeit approaching most issues from a completely opposite ideological orientation. In addition, there is the common vocabulary not only with Acts, but also documents at Qumran, like the Damascus document. It's almost as if the Romans, he says they're from the same source, but it could almost be that the Acts was written from the Pseudo-Clementines by the Romans. The Pseudo-Clementines is kind of like the romanticized version of events, and Acts uses that as their source to write the Roman propaganda, anti-Semitic, but really just anti-Jew from the war propaganda. There are some 5 or 6 speeches attributed to Peter in Acts. In almost every one, rather like the Stephen just noted above, like Saint Stephen, Eisenman is convinced that Stephen, the first martyr, was actually James, the brother of Jesus. So like the Stephen just noted above, he is presented as making the same telltale blood libel accusation, which is never even alluded to in the Pseudo-Clementine narratives. Rather, in the latter, Peter emerges as a gentle soul, never quick to anger, archetypical Essene, as it were, who, like those described in Josephus, quote, wears threadbare clothes, and arises at dawn to greet the sun in prayer, following which he always immerses himself. That is, in the Pseudo-Clementines, Peter is a daily bather. Finally, which is a term that I think that's from the Dead Sea Scrolls too. Finally, in the Pseudo-Clementines, he is the inveterate Jamesian, preaching absolute adherence to a more faithful rendition of James's directives to overseas communities even than those depicted in Acts. It is obviously this sort of portrait that is being deliberately gainsayed in Acts. Not only does Peter receive a Paulinizing vision in Jaffa, where he learns not to make distinctions between holy and profane, nor to call any man profane. It's in Acts 10, 14 through 28. And it never struck me before that episode where Peter has this vision is parallel to Paul's vision in Damascus. So Peter to receive a Paulinizing vision, nor to call any man profane, just in time to greet the representative of the Roman centurion Cornelius. This vision, of course, makes it possible for him to come and visit Cornelius's house and keep table fellowship with him, the prototype for the whole Gentile mission of Paul, and the opposite of the outcome of the confrontations in Antioch in Galatians 2, verses 11 through 14, after the representatives from James come down from Jerusalem. In this last, Peter parts company with Paul, and together with Barnabas, chooses no longer to keep company with him in either work or purse. In return for which Paul accuses both of them of hypocrisy. But of course, the position of the real Peter comes across even here in his exclamation, in response to the heavenly voice, accompanying this storybook vision of a tablecloth descending from heaven, commanding him 3 times to eat unclean foods and not separate holy from profane. No, Lord, no, I have never eaten any profane or unclean thing, he says in Acts 10, verse 14. Indeed, Peter becomes the swing figure exploited in Acts at every opportunity to make the point of its anti-Semitic invective. How completely unhistorical if we are to judge by the pseudo-Clementines, and how sad. The first of these speeches occurs in Acts 2, verses 14 through 36, when Peter speaks on Pentecost to the Jews and pious persons from every nation of those under heaven who were dwelling in Jerusalem. Addressing them, quote, "You took him with your lawless hands, and having crucified him, put him to death," meaning Jesus the Nazarene. "The man set up by God with mighty works and wonders and signs which God worked through him, and given up with the foreknowledge of God." Now, quoting scripture, Peter continues making the second of these blood libel accusations. He was a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn to him with an oath to sit upon his throne. He's got a long parenthetical here. I'm just trying to see if it's going to distract us to go into this. Okay. This in its totality is his first speech, standing with the 11 to the assembled multitudes on Pentecost, and the doctrinal invective it contains is patent. The Peter pictured here was surely not going to win many friends or influence many people in Jerusalem with this kind of language, but the speech obviously was not intended for the ears of those living in Jerusalem, despite its context and the ostensible greeting of the opening line to, quote, "all you who inhabit Jerusalem," but rather to the wider cosmopolitan audience to which it has always been found more meaningful. The next speech follows almost immediately in the next chapter when Peter and John go up to the temple at the 9th hour. That's in Acts 3. Acts is always interested in this type of detail. After straightening out a cripple's crooked bones, Peter again launches into a like-minded speech, clearly paralleling ones in the debates on the temple steps, recorded in the first book of the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions. In that version of quasi-parallel proceedings, which pictures one apostle speaking after another, Peter finally precedes James in a speech to the assembled multitudes, but the message is completely different from the one here in Acts. The issue under discussion in the Recognitions is the nature of the Messiah and the primal Adam ideology. But in Acts, at this juncture, Peter rather berates the crowd over the fact of his miracle working. Quote, "Men, Israelites, why do you wonder at this, as if we made him walk by our own power? The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered up, denying him in the presence of Pilate after he had decided to release him. But you denied the holy and righteous one and demanded that a man who was a murderer be given to you instead." That's the end of the quote. This is totally the approach of the Gospels. But neither here nor in them is it explained why Pilate, as Roman governor, should have offered the Jewish crowd this kind of choice between Barabbas, as the Gospels flesh this out, and Jesus. Still, to drive the point home, and, as in the preceding chapter, making the blood libel accusation 2 times in the same speech, Peter is made to add, quote, "And you killed the author of life, whom God raised up from the dead, of which we are the witnesses." That's in Acts 3:15. Here again, Acts gives the number of those who heard and therefore believed as 5,000. But this is the number Josephus originally gives for the number of the Essenes, as we shall see, as well as the number of the original followers of the Maccabees. It is also, to be sure, continuing the parallel, the number of James's followers in the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions, who flee down to the Jericho area after James has been thrown down and left for dead in the riot allegedly instigated by Paul in the temple, and, of course, the number of people before whom Jesus performs his signs or miracles in the wilderness, in the Gospels, though sometimes it says 4,000 in the Gospels. The next occurrence of this sort of accusation again follows almost immediately. It takes place before the high priest, the prefect Alexander, who is the very important nephew of Philo-Judaeus, the Stoic writer. His nephew, Tiberius Alexander, son of Julius Alexander, who was Titus Caesar's Emperor Titus, and general and emperor Titus, who I'm saying actually wrote the Gospels or under his auspices. Titus Caesar's military commander during the siege of Jerusalem, and with him responsible for the destruction of the temple. This Tiberius Alexander is also, I believe he's on the team Josephus. He's also one of the Jews who wrote the Gospels, along with Josephus and this woman Bernice, certainly according to Joseph Atwill. So he's saying that we're still in the book of Acts. It takes place before the high priest, the prefect Alexander, who is actually Tiberius Alexander, and who's Philo's nephew and Titus Caesar's military commander. which would put the time frame, given the scenario of the Gospels, in the mid-40s. Not a very likely chronology. That's in parentheses there, though. The rulers, so before the high priest prefect Alexander, the rulers, elders, and other high priests and scribes, representing, as stated further along, the Sanhedrin. Here Peter is presented as saying, quote, rulers of the people and elders of Israel, if we are tried today for a good work to a lame man who has been cured, let it be known. Eisenman here, interestingly, says that generally good works were normally thought of as works of the law in Judaism, but in Greek or Hellenistic style, those are the kind of miracles that Jesus uses, these curings. He calls them Asclepius-like curings, which is interesting. So the whole concept of Jesus healing or curing lame people and the apostles as well, that's a really a Hellenistic style thing, as opposed to in the Jewish tradition. There isn't any of that in the Old Testament, apparently. Not that I can remember. Let it be known to you all the people of Israel, that it is in the name of Jesus Christ, the Nazarene, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. It is by him that he standing before you has been made whole. That's in Acts 4, 8, verses 8 through 10. The fourth speech of this genre Peter makes again occurs in the very next chapter, this time directly paralleling the picture in the Pseudo-Clementine's recognition, because he and all the apostles have been standing and preaching in the temple. The standing, that term standing is of some importance, but we'll just move on. The standard arrest then takes place, though the prisons must have been exceptionally large, since now one has to do with all the apostles, not just Peter and John. And after a miraculous escape, once again, they are standing in the temple and teaching the people. In addition, like the Essenes and the picture of Peter's daily bathing in the Pseudo-Clementine homilies, the time now is at dawn. Okay, so this is still referring to the book of Acts, chapter 5. Yet again, Peter and the apostles are arrested and placed before what is now called the Sanhedrin, a body that must have found it unusual, if not more than a little inconvenient, to have so many meetings in so short a span of time. Responding to the high priest's admonishments not to teach in this name, filling Jerusalem with, and bringing upon us the blood of this man. Peter insists, quote, it is right to obey God rather than men. Usages, end quote, usages such as these comparing God to men will also be reminiscent of polemical repartee between James in the letter ascribed to his name and Paul in his letters. Peter then completes his defense with the sixth allusion to the blood libel accusation in just 4 chapters. Quote, the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you killed by crucifixion, a prince and a savior, whom God has exalted by his right hand, These words, by his right hand, are the ones Jesus uses in last appearances in the Gospels, and the proclamation attributed to James in the speech he makes on the pinnacle of the temple before being stoned in early church texts, and the second apocalypse of James from Nag Hammadi, which is the Gnostic Gospels. It will also be part of the climactic Pesher on Habakkuk 2:16's cup of the right hand of the Lord, which will be exploited to describe how the cup of wrath of God would swallow him as a reward for what he did to the righteous teacher and his followers among the poor, or the Ebionites. So that's from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Habakkuk Pesher. So, what he's getting at, really, though, is we're just in the first 5 chapters of Acts, and Peter has already made 6 speeches condemning the Jews for killing Jesus. So, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to guess that the Romans are the people who inserted those speeches, because they were the ones who were needing to pacify the Jews, and they were the ones who were fighting wars against the Jews at this very time, or had just gotten done fighting a war. Titus was actually wounded in the war, as was Vespasian. So they were not pleased with the Jews, and they were attempting to put together some war propaganda to put certain segments of them, in a bad light. So we're going to return to this tomorrow and get further into Peter speaking and condemning the Jews, which is just quite odd when you think about it, as recounted by Robert Eisenman. Now, there are certainly other explanations as well, but this is, I like going through Eisenman because he's read all this stuff, and he's surveyed the whole territory of the hundreds of works of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also the Pseudo-Clementines and all this other stuff. Most scholars haven't been exposed to that kind of breadth of material. Okay, thanks for tuning in today.